Good morning, I'm Morgan of Morgan Donner Sewing Party, and in this video I'm going to show you how I make this 16th century Venetian dress. Alright, I'm going to start things off a little bit out of order today. I will get to the dress in just a moment, but first I want to show you a method I've discovered for lacing a bodice. I've seen all sorts of ways to construct a bodice with invisible lacing holes, but many have downsides such as not laying flat, bunching up, or just being sort of bulky and inelegant. I did some brainstorming before starting this outfit and decided to experiment with some scrap fabric. Now, I don't need this whole bodice to be boned since it is on top of a corset already, but I wasn't sure whether or not I would need a bone in the center front to prevent lacing from collapsing on itself. So for my first try, I'm lacing with no bone, and the result is, yeah, one layer of silk and one layer of linen is definitely not going to be enough. For round two, I added some canvas, and that did help a lot, but it was not quite as stiff as I wanted it to be. So I went ahead and added a bone. Part of the reason I was reluctant to add a bone from the get-go is I often see the boning channel that's sewn here, and I really wanted to avoid having a visible dent in my smooth bodice line. I had a thought about how to bone the front without having a visible channel by sewing the bone casing using the canvas interfacing, not letting the needle go all the way to the surface. Just having a bone in the seam wasn't enough to keep everything smooth. Turns out the best way to have that happen was to have the lacings go around the bone each time they enter the bodice. That shouldn't be very surprising, since corsets also have the lacing supported by a bone on the very edge right next to the eyelets and grommets, and it goes around that bone each time it laces the side. I'm very excited by this lacing method. I think it's going to be a great way to have a smooth look with no visible boning channel seam. I make absolutely no claims as to its historical authenticity. This is purely a modern experiment. Now I can start working on the actual pattern. I have a note on the pattern paper letting me know that it does not include any seam allowance, so I must add that now as I trace out the pattern. I tend to prefer a 1 centimeter seam allowance, but use whatever works for you. Pinning the edge before you cut the layers out helps keep everything nice and aligned. This bodice is going to be 3 layers of fabric, a bright red silk for the outside and a linen inner lining, and then another linen layer for the lining. I keep the red and inner lining layers together, essentially treating them as if they are one piece of fabric. I can go ahead and sew the shoulder and side seams now, keeping that 1 centimeter seam allowance I mentioned before. Once the seams are sewn, I like to open them up because that makes them lay flatter on the finished garment. Then I fold over the edges, again about 1 centimeter, and pin them down. Then I can sew the seam allowances down, and you can see why I needed an inner lining now. With each stitch, I am going through the seam allowance edge, and then I'm tacking it down to just the white linen inner lining, not letting the needle go all the way through the surface of the red fabric where my stitch would be visible. I might not worry so much about visible stitch marks if I were sewing with a different fabric, something thicker, maybe a wool, but this red shows every little pinprick. The lining comes next. I set it down on the bodice and line the pieces up as best I can and start tacking it down with pins so it doesn't move. Then I can start folding the edge under and pinning the lining in place. I like to hand sew my linings in for historical outfits. It's not nearly as fast as machine bag lining, but you do get a lot of control that bag lining lacks. As I turn my various edges, I will snip corners and curves as needed to make the lining lie smoothly. I tend to make the lining go just short of the absolute edge of the garment, since that way you won't see the lining on the finished project while someone's wearing it. I could have sewn the entire lining shell together and then hand turned in all the edges, but instead I'm putting the pieces in one by one. There's only 3 of them, so it didn't really make much of a difference which way I did it. This method is kind of nice if you ever need to alter your side seams later. Whip stitch all those seams down, again taking care not to have your stitch end up on the outside of the fabric where it will be visible. I left the front lacing edges unfinished so far, so I can add in some canvas interfacing to reinforce those lacing holes. And I still kind of want to decide how big I want that lacing gap to be. I'll fold the edges temporarily for now, and then try it on to see how it looks. It looks pretty good, but I think I want a wider gap, like I've seen on some of the late 16th century Venetian dresses. The skirt is just going to be a giant rectangle with a little bit of waist shaping to account for the point in the bodice on the front and back. I pleated the waist of the skirt down and pinned it onto my dress dummy so I can see what the fullness of the skirt's going to look like. This is 2 widths of fabric, so a little bit over 100 inches at the hem. I decided I wanted it a little bit fuller than this because I'm going for a super over-the-top look on this dress. I sewed all of the vertical seams of the skirt on the machine and then ironed them open and folded the selvage or seam allowance in at the top of the front seam, since I'm going to want to split the skirt a little bit here and I want it to be nice and neat. The waist of the skirt is going to be hand sewn into the waist of the bodice. So first I need to finish the seam. Nothing fancy, just turning the edge over twice and whip stitching it down. Back to the bodice. I added the canvas interfacing and turned the front edge once and sewed it down by machine. Now comes the tricky bit. I need to bone the front seam and also lace it at the same time. First, I measure my lacing holes. I think I did maybe 1 inch apart here. Unfortunately, I really wasn't quite thinking clearly, and I set my holes to be spiral laced, forgetting that this style of gown is generally ladder laced. So after I had already poked one set of holes, I had to redo them to fix my mistake. Once the lacing holes were correct, I ladder laced the opening and cut my boning pieces down to size and wove them through the ribbon bars here. Then I could hand sew the seam allowance down, carefully stitching so that I went all the way through the canvas interfacing, which is my support and structure here, but not all the way through to the front side of the bodice. The downside of this lacing method is that you really do not want the ribbon to come undone out of the lacing holes, because then you would need to undo this whip stitching, fix the lacing, and then re-sew the edge down. It wouldn't be the end of the world, but it would be very annoying. So I made sure to use a very long ribbon that hopefully will not ever need to be undone in order to get in and out of the dress. I think I cut it about 3 meters long. To add the skirt to the bodice, I gathered the top of the skirt evenly with a strong thread and then pinned one side of the gathered mass to the edge of the inside-out bodice. Be careful that you are sewing right side to right side. If you've never done cartridge pleating before, I recommend sewing a little scrap fabric test swatch to get the technique down before trying it out on a full-fledged project. Lots of whip stitching later, and I have a dress to try on. First, I put on my supportive layer, the polka dot farthingale, and then I add a temporary canvas placket to cover the front of my underbodice. I slip the red dress on over my head and tighten the laces up until everything lies smooth. Now you can see the glorious mass that is my new dress. The skirt on this thing is absolutely huge. The hem does not need a lot of adjustment. It's already about right. I made it a little bit longer in the back on purpose, hoping to get a slight train effect. Looking back on this now, I kinda wish I'd gone for a little bit longer in the back, maybe 5 or 10 more inches. Since the length of the hem is good, I went ahead and finished the hem with my favorite stitch. In case you're curious as to how I go about making a knot at the end of the thread, here you go. Ta-da! Alright, and we are hemmed! Say hello to Catherine! Boop! Time to start making sleeves. I'm starting out with a sleeve that I'd already made previously and tracing it since I apparently lost the original pattern for it. Then I have some minor adjustments to make, including adding a seam allowance for once, and when I'm satisfied, I can go ahead and cut out this paper pattern. The sleeves are going to be made of the same red silk as the dress, and also lined in the same white linen. Pinning keeps the pieces together as I cut, although maybe one day I'll get fancy and buy myself a rotary cutter and mat. That way I wouldn't need to pin. Oh well. I want these sleeves to be slashed at the top, just like the sleeves I'm copying, although I think I want a few more slashes, so I'll go ahead and make 8 on each sleeve instead of just 6. I mark out where the slashes will be with chalk, and make sure I transfer them to all the different pieces. I don't quite want to sew both sleeve seams just yet, since that'll be much harder than leaving them mostly flat at this point. So just do one seam on each sleeve. I picked the front or concave seam. To create the slashes, I sew around my marked lines with a very tiny little seam allowance, over and over and over until I have all of the slash lines sewn. Then I cut down the center of each of those little lines to separate my slashes. Cut all your excess fabric from the corners. Now I can turn everything right side out. I mostly just use my hands to coax the corners out, but sometimes using a blunt needle or pin to pull out the last little bit of a corner helps. To finish the second seam of the sleeves, I machine sew the red and white fabric separately, taking care not to catch any of the completed shoulder slashes in my seam. The only raw edges left are at the wrist. I am loath to machine top stitch on this little last bit of hem, so hand finishing it is. First, some basting straight stitches, just to hold that first fold down. Then I'm pinning a decorative strip of fabric that will eventually be pinked. I sew the sleeve onto the decorative strip as invisibly as possible. Whip, 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 whip. The lining needs to be finished too, so the seam allowance gets folded down, pinned, and sewn in place. Not so invisibly this time, since it's on the inside of the garment and I'm lazy. I'm pinking the decorative strip with the tip of my scissors. It's just a little tiny cut. You can barely even see it until you rough it up a little bit. This detail is actually a historical thing. Go me! I made the wrist of these sleeves a little bit more fitted, small enough that I can't just squeeze my hand through like I could on the original sleeve, so I need to sew buttons and buttonholes on the edge of the wrist closure. Sorry that this isn't very visible. Red on red is a little hard to see on camera. The buttons, a very historically accurate ye olde plastic from my local sewing shop, are sewn to the other cuff edge. The bottoms of the sleeves are done, so let's go ahead and go back up to the top. The slashes are finished, but still loose, and need to be bound together at the corners. Nothing fancy about this step, just stitching them enough to keep them from coming apart, and they're all done. I want to tie the sleeves onto the shoulder straps of the bodice with some fancy ribbon. The ribbon will look extra fancy if I bind the tips with aglets. Here's how I do it. Gather the ribbon end with several rows of running stitches, and then pull tight. Wrap the thread around the narrow gathered end to bind everything together, and clip any stray threads. Insert the ribbon into the aglet and sew in place with several stitches. The top 4 strips of the sleeves get pierced with an awl, and then I can easily thread a ribbon through. Look at how pretty that is. I need to attach this sleeve to the bodice, so I figure out my placement first, and then I put a pin where each of the corresponding ribbon holes will need to go. I think I was getting pretty close to my project deadline here, because I didn't film very much after this. The last little bit here is the white guards around the bodice and hem of the skirt. Normally, I prefer to make my own trim by cutting down fabric into long strips, kind of like making your own bias tape, but I was a little bit short on time here and went for store-bought instead. I measured out my placement with a gift card I had laying around, and then sewed the ribbon down by hand on both edges. Lots of off-camera sewing, and ta-da! The dress is done! To get dressed, I start out with the farthingale from my last video, and then put a pretty partlet on top. This is to cover my shoulders and help hide the supportive undergown. I made this from sheer silk organza, and then decorated it with a grid of white braid and pewter spangles. This stomacher covers the front of my corset bodies. I made it by gathering linen over a piece of canvas to imitate the look of a gathered shift beneath a dress. With a lot of wiggling, I can put the overgown on and tighten it into place. Here's a look at the finished outfit. Alright, I hope you guys enjoyed watching that video on how I went about making this dress. If there's anything that you have questions about, maybe I forgot to cover something, go ahead and comment below and I'll answer as best as I can. I'm looking forward to my next video. It might not be sewing related, but that's okay. As long as you're into the historical garments, you're probably still going to be into what I'm making next. Until next time, good night guys.